Hey guys, welcome to Through the Bible Plain and Simple. And we are beginning our verse by verse study through the entire Bible, beginning in the book of Genesis. So I want to continue on doing my introduction to this book, to the study. Because again, as we're studying in the Old Testament, and I remember I left off with this thought that I didn't finish. If a person says, I want to read the Bible, where should I start? And I said really that there's no bad place to start. It's just that you have to understand where you're starting from. Meaning this. As we are studying in the Old Testament, and we are doing a verse by verse, book by book, and then chapter by chapter, the question is, not the question, let me make the statement, that what we're doing is we're going to be looking at what is God saying. One of the problems that when people read, they want to extract and then reapply scripture. And that's a disaster because you kind of lose the meaning of what was the intended meaning. In other words, why did he say the statement in the first place? And no other book has probably been abused more than the book of Genesis. And again, we'll get into that more later. So it's important to understand, of course, that when you're reading, there are messages. And let me kind of break down the Bible as a book, the Bible, what we call the Bible. And so the first thing is, the Bible itself is kind of again, in our minds, we forget that we are looking at is a collection of books. That's what the word Bible itself means. So people say this book, right? When we talk about this book, right? This is a Bible, right? This is a Bible. However, this is 66 individual books. And in the case of Psalms is actually a collection of 150 individual psalms or songs. Proverbs is a collection of, I believe, I don't know, you have to break it down, 1800 maybe Proverbs, individual sayings, okay? So the point of that, these are individual books written over a period of about 1500 years, okay? So if you start with Jesus, the time period of Jesus' birth, so what, AD 0, right? Okay, AD 0. You start there, and the way our timetable goes, you start at that point. So from Jesus' perspective, you come forward. So AD 0, then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, so on. Now we're in since Jesus 2020, right? 21. Go back to AD 0 when Jesus was born, and then what happens, they start counting backwards. BC, so AD, after what's called after it's actually not after the death of Christ, is I forgot the term, Adonai something, but the BC, and actually you even hear this term BCE or ACE. Well, BCE means before the common era, but anyway, we're not going to get off too into that, thick into that woods. But if you start counting and you start going back, right? So you count back to the writing of Moses, to the time, and we get you're going to be around 1500 years. And we'll get more into that when we're talking about genealogies and stuff. So with the book of Genesis, Moses wrote the the first 5 books of the Bible. So that meant that approximately 2,000 years after Adam, so the events of Genesis precede Moses by about 2,000 years, okay? He's writing about these events going back. The Bible, so that's how the dating is spanned. We have 66 different books during those period of time. So all the way up until AD 100, the book of Revelation is believed to have been written by the Apostle John. So I'm AD 195 to AD 105, depending on how you want to date that. Okay, so the Bible itself then is a collection of the inspired writings of apostles and prophets, and then others. So not all the writers were apostles or prophets, but they all were inspired. So the 66 book, what the 66 books are, and this is important, the 66 books is the complete revelation of God to man. And this is important. The Bible is God's revelation to man on what he wanted man to know. Very important, because we get questions sometimes is, how come we don't have more biopics? Why don't we have more detailed information? Right? So the Bible is a collection, okay, but it is one revelation. So though it is 66 individual books, a collection of books, it is one revelation of what God wanted to say to man. That's the most important thing right there. It is a revelation of what God wanted to say to man, not what man thinks God needs to say. Now that's important, because what God didn't say becomes important in this respect. If he didn't say it, it's because it doesn't matter to him. So oftentimes people will say, well, how come God doesn't deal with this subject, or how come God doesn't deal with that subject? Not important. What's important is the biblical narrative is what God wanted us to know. That's what's important. So having said that, then when we come to the book of Genesis, the first 5 books, especially Genesis is, again, the account of the creation of the world as what God wanted to say about it. Alright, so now the Old Testament, before I get back to getting into Genesis now, so the Old Testament, as we look at this, okay, some of you seminary people will kind of somewhat maybe appreciate what is typically called a New Testament, Old Testament survey. We're not going to get that deep, however, but to understand how the book of Genesis, or the Bible, is laid out. The first 5 books, and the reason why you have the Bible is sectioned off, okay, and it is sectioned off into various sections. From Genesis to Esther is a kind of a continual narrative, historical narrative of man, the fall of man, the creation of the nation of Israel through Abraham, and coming all the way to a post-Babylonian exile, but a kind of a restoration going back, and then we stop. Okay, so we got a historical narrative there from that book. Okay, which is sort of the majority of the Old Testament from a historical perspective. Then we have the reason, and so from a dating standpoint, those books are in order pretty much at the events, the dating of the events. So Moses writing about Genesis, obviously we start from before the creation of man to the creation of the universe and all of that with God. So obviously, but as far as the dating is concerned, the oldest writings, the book of Job would be the oldest writing, dating around the time of Abraham. Then you have in that section, so we have the next section would be the book of Job. Then it's Job, Psalm, Proverbs, I think Song of Solomon, and I'm missing one. But the reason why I bring up the book of Job is because that is actually the oldest writing. In other words, the oldest dated writing. Again, written around the time of Abraham. Okay? Those are often called the section with the books of wisdom, and not so much poetry, people say that, but wisdom, and you have Psalms like that. A lot of wisdom in those kind of books right there. And then the last section of the Old Testament is what's called the writings of the prophets. And they're divided into two sections, the major prophets and the minor prophets. I don't think that's the best designation, of course, but I wasn't around when they when they arranged this. And this is why I'm going to say this. The bulk of the writings of the of the prophets, and they're the whole reason why you have that, but the dating, Isaiah is probably one of the earliest of the major prophets. And as I said, remember, the books are arranged as best, maybe not perfect, but as best from the date of the writing. Now clearly when you have Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, but Lamentations is believed to be written by Jeremiah, but then Ezekiel and Daniel, those, for clearly you could say that Isaiah was written before, some 80 years before Jeremiah. When we come to the minor prophets, and again, not to split hairs. It's not worth the split hairs, or they getting a big debate over it, because in a sense, the major prophets, we could say, are the major prophetic voices of the Old Testaments. Even God Himself kind of ranks them. So, for example, God mentions Daniel as I think He's talking to. I'm trying to think where who He's talking to. And He says, "Are you wiser than Daniel?" Right. So Daniel, there's some prophets that God Himself mentions, and that God Himself will say are major. So, for that sense, and you can say those are major prophets. But from the standpoint of the word of the Lord, there's really no major or minor prophets. However, the reason why I disagree with the section is because the timing. So when we talk about starting with Hosea, and you go all the way, those minor prophets, because they are arranged in the latter half of the the writings of the prophets. So when the Bible talks about the law and the writings of the prophets, this section here, so all the way to Zephaniah, those writings really come around the same time frame as Isaiah. Okay, and I think it's important to understand that, is because you get the timing of the prophetic voice, the message. Isaiah, in his time, he begins his prophetic message. He begins to warn the people of Israel to turn away from their sins, or else judgment is coming. So the other prophetic writing, minor prophets are doing the same. They're in around that time. Now the last three of the minor prophets, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, they are post-Babylonian prophets, meaning Isaiah prophesied judgment is coming for their sins. They ignore God's warning, and of course judgment comes. Nebuchadnezzar wipes out Jerusalem, destroys the temple, and then he exported, he brings into exile all of the Jews. Okay, that lasts for 70 years, and then after 70 years, they go back, and this is when you see, even in the first narrative, you see Nehemiah, Ezra, and Esther are post-exile time period. Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi are also post-prophets. So that's why, again, so those are the kind of sections there for the writing. So that's the kind of the bulk of the Old Testament right there. And there's a lot of information, of course, in terms of the narrative. So you got the writings of the prophets, and of course you're going to see a lot of prophetic revelation as far as Israel is concerned. But we'll get to that when we get to those books. So Moses in writing, okay, and again, Moses is writing some 2,000, anywhere from 2,000 to 2,500 years after the events of Adam, okay, and then he's writing his narrative with Genesis, and then so his books, so the first 5 books, it's going to bring us into the law, and actually his writing brings us up to the very day he dies. So right there at the end of Deuteronomy is this Moses actually last day. He actually pins Deuteronomy. He's speaking to the people, and then he ends. He goes up into the mountain, and they don't see him again. They don't see any more of him. And then he dies up in there. God sent Michael the archangel actually to come and bury Moses. Okay, actually comes and bury Moses. All right, so that's the outlay of the Old Testament. Now, when we come to the New Testament, it's a little different. New Testament then is a little, you got the New Testament writers, and again, understand it is God's revelation of what God wanted us to say. And the reason why that's important, even though we're not going to do a deep dive in there by no means, is because that's why we have 13 letters from Paul himself, because it's what God, the revelation that God has given Paul, and what God wanted to say to us through Paul. In other words, we have more letters from Paul than we have from Peter. We only have 2 letters from Peter, 13 from Paul. Okay, and the reason why I say 13 is because the big controversy of who wrote the book of Hebrews, letter of Hebrews. But since we're so far away from there, we dealt with that. In fact, if you want to go back into I don't know how far you can go back on Facebook, but you can go on the Bible Perspective, my YouTube page, the Bible Perspective, and I think those are all preserved there. Okay, if you want to get back into those studies. All right, so, but that is sort of the outlay then of the what's called the books of the Bible. Okay. What is interesting to know is that they all have a common thread. They all have a common thread. The revelation that God wanted us to say. It's not even a historical kind of account as much as this is what God is saying. The history is accurate, but all right, guys, look, I'll continue on with this introduction in our next study. Thanks everybody for tuning in. See you next time.